In the headlines, in one of the biggest shifts in Japan's military policy since the Second World War, the country lifts the ban on its right to exercise collective self-defense. South Korea reacts to North Korea's recent overture, and it's a negative one. Seoul called for Pyongyang's denuclearization first. And Korea's June exports grow 2.5% on year, putting the first half's export volume at a record high. But the strong Korean won is watched. Hello and welcome to the program. I'm Kang Tae-ri in Seoul. We begin with the landmark decision out of Japan, where the cabinet has given its okay for a significant shift in military policy. Gone is a decades-long ban on the right to collective self-defense, meaning Japanese troops will now be allowed to fight overseas in defense of its allies. Song Ji-sun reports.
A ban that dates back to the end of World War II lifted. In a significant recasting of military policy away from its pacifist policies, the Abe administration has reclaimed the right to send its soldiers into battle even when the country is not under direct attack. Following approval by lawmakers on Tuesday, the cabinet adopted a resolution dropping a ban that has kept the military from fighting overseas since World War II. This means Japanese troops will be able to come to the aid of allies if they come under attack from a common enemy, even if Japan is not the subject of the attack. Tokyo will also be able to take on a greater role in UN peacekeeping missions. After losing World War II, Japan was forced to dismantle its military and adopt a constitution that allows the use of arms only in the event it is attacked on its territory. But interpretations of the constitution have since been stretched over the years to allow for the strengthening of Japan's self-defense forces. Japan's Prime Minister Shinzo Abe has been aggressively pursuing the change since taking office. But Korea and China, major victims of Japan's past wartime aggression, have expressed opposition. South Korea's foreign ministry has said that Japanese forces will not be allowed on the Korean peninsula without prior consent. Song Ji-sun, ARIRANG News.
Nonsense and insincere. That's how South Korea has labeled a proposal by North Korea to end all cross-border hostilities. Seoul said peace on the Korean peninsula can only be realized once Pyongyang takes serious steps to dismantle its nuclear program. Hwang Sung-hee tells us more.
South Korea rejected on Tuesday North Korea's so-called special proposal to end all military hostilities between the two Koreas. On Monday, the North proposed to halt cross-border slandering and military provocations starting Friday and called for upcoming joint military drills between Seoul and Washington to be canceled. Sound familiar? The regime had made a similar proposal earlier this year in what it called an important proposal.
North Korea proposed in January to end cross-border slandering but broke the inter-Korean agreement shortly thereafter, and has been hurling offensive remarks at our leader and launching provocations ever since.
Calling the latest proposal nonsense and insincere, Seoul's Unification Ministry said North Korea's nuclear and missile development programs are the biggest threats on the Korean peninsula. The ministry said North Korea must let go of its nuclear program if it really wants lasting peace in the region. On what had motivated Pyongyang to make the sudden proposal, an official at the ministry said the regime may have been attempting to show its efforts at mending inter-Korean ties ahead of Chinese President Xi Jinping's visit to Seoul this week. Hwang Sung-hee, ARIRANG News.
And in the meantime, high-level officials from North Korea and Japan sat down for talks in Beijing on this Tuesday to hammer out the details of a previous deal that promises to reopen an investigation into the abductions of Japanese nationals decades ago. The meeting went ahead despite the speculation that Japan might pull out in protest of North Korea's recent launch of short-range missiles over this weekend. Yoo Ri-an tells us more.
Tuesday's high-level meeting between Japan and North Korea began with an exchange of strong words over Pyongyang's firing of 2 short-range missiles into the East Sea between the two nations over the weekend. In his opening remarks, Japan's chief delegate to the talks, Junichi Ihara, launched a strong protest against the launch, calling it a violation of UN Security Council resolutions. His North Korean counterpart Song Il-ho said Pyongyang has made it clear that they do not recognize the resolutions and insisted that the test firings were safe and fully consistent with maintaining peace and stability in the region. Despite the tensions, the two countries did agree to continue constructive talks on reinvestigating the abduction of Japanese nationals by North Korean agents in the 1970s and 80s. In a diplomatic breakthrough, the two countries struck a deal in Stockholm last month on reopening the abduction probe. In return, Japan has promised to lift some sanctions and resume humanitarian aid to North Korea. Pyongyang on Tuesday reportedly briefed Japan about the special investigative team it has assembled to look into the Japanese abductee issue. Japanese Prime Minister Shinzo Abe is looking over the details and is expected to decide on Wednesday whether his government will lift partial sanctions on the communist state, and if so, to what scale. Yurian, ARIRANG News.
South Korea is welcoming Chinese President Xi Jinping to Seoul later this week. Now, this Chinese leader breaking away from tradition in visiting Seoul before going to Pyongyang is set to discuss ways to help denuclearize the Korean peninsula during his summit talks with the South Korean President Park Geun-hye. Park Ji-won tells us more.
This week's trip will mark the first time for a Chinese leader to visit South Korea before North Korea. Chinese President Xi Jinping will visit Seoul for 2 days starting this Thursday in a visit that is expected to send a strong message to Beijing's traditional ally. Relations between China and North Korea have soured recently. Beijing was not happy when Pyongyang went ahead with a third nuclear test in February of last year, despite China's warnings. China's leadership was also deeply disappointed by the purge and subsequent execution of North Korean leader Kim Jong-un's uncle Chang Song-taek late last year. Chang, who enjoyed a good relationship with Beijing, have made major contributions to an expansion of commercial ties with China, while measures to end Pyongyang's nuclear program are expected to top the agenda during their bilateral summit talks. President Xi and South Korean President Park Geun-hye will also discuss other issues, including ways to deepen their economic cooperation. Watchers say that as China is South Korea's top trade partner and South Korea has the highest number of Chinese language proficiency test takers, it's only natural the two countries' ties have strengthened. The summit meeting also signifies a shift in multilateral relations in Northeast Asia, where the traditional Cold War front of South Korea, the US and Japan versus North Korea, China and Russia is looking increasingly more complex. While South Korea and China continue to butt heads with Japan over various historical and territorial disputes, Japan and North Korea are taking strides to normalize their once frosty bilateral relations. Park Ji-won, ARIRANG News.
For the latest in news that impacts Korea and the world, join Kang Chae-ri for a lively half hour that covers politics, business, international news, and much more. Live at 8 every weeknight on ARIRANG TV.
Human Rights Council headquarters in Geneva on Thursday, finding ways to persuade. Korea's consumer price growth remained just under 2% for the 8th straight month in June. Statistics Korea says the country's consumer price index rose 1.7% last month on year, the same growth rate recorded in May, which was the month that saw the highest growth in CPI in 19 months. But this still comes well below the Bank of Korea's target band between 2.5% and 3.5%. Korea's stock market is losing momentum, with the benchmark Kospi fluctuating in the smallest margin ever in the first 6 months of this year. Analysts say this is mainly due to slowing economic growth at home. Hwang Jie tells us more.
It's as if the Korean stock market has had its pause button pushed. The Korea Exchange says the nation's benchmark Kospi is losing its vitality, with market volatility in the first half of the year hitting a mere 0.6, its lowest point since 1990 when the market first opened. The closer the index is to zero, the more stagnant the market. The figure was at over 2 in the second half of 2011, but has continued on a downward trend ever since. And it's not just the dynamism, but also the number of transactions that remains subdued. The average daily transactions volume on the nation's main bourse came in at around 23 million in the first half of this year, marking the lowest level in 7.5 years. Analysts attribute the lackluster performance over the past 3 years to sluggish domestic demand and the slowing Chinese economy.
Korea is heavily dependent on exports to China. The nation's industries are also closely linked to those in China, so the slumping economy there had a major impact on the economy here.
Analysts add that the recent strength in the local currency trend has eroded the profitability of local companies and is keeping the stock market from perking up, but they also forecast better conditions in the second half. They say the global economy, more importantly the U.S. economy, is on a rebound trend, which will result in more robust exports for Korea, eventually raise local corporate profitability, and put some pep in the stock market's step. 황지혜, ARIRANG News.
Tariffs on imported European cars have been lowered or eliminated as part of Korea's free trade agreement with the EU, which entered its fourth year on this Tuesday. Starting today, tariffs imposed on imported autos with an engine 1.5 liters or larger have been lifted, while tariffs levied on cars with smaller engines have been lowered from 4% down to 2.6%. Korean exports in the first half of this year enjoyed record numbers, with shipments of mobile communication devices and semiconductors leading the way. But as our Connie Kim reports, the numbers don't tell the whole story.
Korea's exports have hit a record in terms of dollar value in the first half of this year, backed by the recovery of major economies. On a daily basis, the nation's overseas shipment has jumped to its highest at 4.5% from the previous year, logging $2.28 billion. Exports to advanced economies have played a positive role, with exports to the European Union rising the most at more than 11% and the United States at about 8%. Shipments of mobile communication devices rose at its sharpest pace at more than 12%, followed by semiconductors, steel, shipments, and automobiles. The Trade Ministry also attributed the record high data to the improved performances of small and medium-sized businesses. Exports of these mid-sized companies have increased slightly more than 8%, while conglomerates' foreign shipping rose a mere 1% in the first quarter of this year. It's a record high, but the strong won held back South Korean exporters in the first half of the year.
The 2.6% rise in exports is lower than expected. Emerging economies are fastly catching up, while the product technology falls behind advanced nations. Moreover, the strengthening of the won was a factor, lowering the nation's total exports.
The $1 exchange rate in the second quarter of last year was in its 1100 range, while the exchange rate has fallen to the 1010 range. And Kim says the second half of this year's exports are not expected to pick up.
We were expecting the export to increase about 5 to 6% this year, but with the 2.6% growth in exports in the first half this year, the growth rate is not expected to pick up. The export growth for this year is not expected to reach 5%.
Connie Kim, ARIRANG News.
Scientists around the world have tried and failed to find a cure for Alzheimer's disease since its discovery in 1906. But now, a Korean research team has identified the cause of memory loss from this most common form of dementia, which could potentially open up gateways to treatment of this fatal brain disease. Kwon Soo-ah explains.
In a scene from the Korean movie A Moment to Remember, a young woman suffering from Alzheimer's can't find her way home due to memory loss brought on by the disease, which doesn't just steal one's memory, but is fatal and incurable. But now, a Korean research team has discovered the source of what leads to the loss of memory in Alzheimer's, which is raising hopes of opening a new chapter in the development of treatments. The cause of the impairment, researchers say, lies in the so-called reactive astrocytes that develop once the brain is affected by the disease. Astrocytes are the most abundant cell type in the brain, and reactive astrocytes produce an acid called gamma-aminobutyric or GABA. They found that these acids in affected mice began to produce abnormally large amounts of GABA. An experiment showed that mice that were injected with an inhibitor called selegiline, which suppresses the generation of GABA, regained their memories. However, after more than 2 weeks during which the injections were administered, the effects disappeared, which calls for the next step in the research process.
We found that the effects of selegiline grow weaker when it is taken in for a long time. We are currently working on the development of 3 kinds of inhibitors with long-lasting efficacy.
The research, supported by the Korea Institute of Science and Technology, has been published in the highly cited medical journal Nature Medicine. Kwon So-ah, ARIRANG News.
And let's get you updated on the 2014 World Cup action in Brazil. France made it to the quarterfinals in Monday's action, beating Nigeria 2-0. It was a relatively close match up until Paul Pogba scored France's first goal in the 79th minute. And despite Nigeria's tireless efforts, Joseph Yobo's own goal secured France's advance to the last 8. France is meeting Germany in the next round after the Germans beat Algeria 2-1 after extra time in a thrilling end-to-end match. Kickoff time for the France-Germany quarterfinal is Saturday, July 5th at 1 a.m. Korea time. And now here's a look at tomorrow's games. The Ukrainian government says it's launched full-scale military operations against pro-Russian rebels as the security forces try to retake the eastern part of the country. And of course, Paul is joining us from the news center. Paul, this declaration by Kiev comes just hours after a ceasefire, which was pretty much fragile, ended. What kind of action does the military plan to take?
While speaking at a parliamentary session on Tuesday morning, Ukraine's leaders said the armed forces have renewed what they called an anti-terrorist operation, which would launch airstrikes and artillery assaults against separatist strongholds in regions such as Donetsk and Luhansk. Ukrainian government officials and rebel fighters have blamed each other for repeatedly violating the ceasefire agreement. Kiev's foreign ministry said at least 27 Ukrainian servicemen had been killed since the truce was implemented on June 20th. President Poroshenko said that he decided to call off the ceasefire as Russia showed no concrete steps to de-escalate the crisis.
We will attack and free our land. Non-extension of ceasefire plan is our response to terrorists, rebels, and marauders, to all those who torture civilians, who paralyze the country's economy, who deprive people of normal, peaceful life.
The French presidential office had said Ukraine and Russia agreed to continue work on a long-term bilateral ceasefire following four-way talks among leaders of Ukraine, Russia, France, and Germany.
I see. Now heading back to Asia, Hong Kong is celebrating its 17th anniversary of its return to China. How did the celebrations go?
Well, Hong Kong marked the occasion with an official flag-raising ceremony near Victoria Harbour on this Tuesday to commemorate when the former British colony was returned to Beijing. The ceremony was attended by 2,500 spectators, including leading Chinese government officials. Hong Kong's chief executive said the city had enjoyed the benefits of having two systems under one country.
In Hong Kong, the economy has grown moderately. There is no employment problem. The income of the common person has increased significantly and prices are stable. The government is running a fiscal surplus. Everyone should work together to maintain the situation and avoid any behavior that affects Hong Kong's stability.
At the same time, tens of thousands of protesters have begun to gather for what organizers say could be the city's largest pro-democracy rally in over a decade, to put pressure on Beijing for greater freedoms to directly elect their own leaders. The massive protest comes just days after an unprecedented 800,000 residents voted in an unofficial referendum for democratic reforms.
And now GM has announced that it's recalling more than 8 million cars due to problems with its ignition switches. It looks like this GM can never catch a break these days. How much cost are we talking about for GM?
According to GM officials, the recall-related repairs will cost upwards of $1.2 billion. The recall affects 6 models produced between 1997 and 2014 in North America, bringing the total number of cars recalled to 29 million. The announcement came just hours after GM unveiled its victim compensation fund tied to a controversial cover-up of its ignition switch defects. The terms of the compensation fund will have no upper cap and identifies 13 deaths linked to the faulty switches.
Well, I'm certainly glad that the fund will not require us to be silent, myself in particular. I know a lot of people know this. I'm an advocate for a lot of different change in the automotive industry as well now. And so silence was certainly a non-starter for me. As far as compensation, that really depends.
GM is recommending that drivers of the recalled models take everything off their keychain, as the extra weight could accidentally turn off the engine, along with the car's power steering and brakes.
And finally, Forbes magazine has released its annual list of the world's most powerful celebrities. Always fun to look at. And Beyonce tops the rankings. Give us a breakdown of these powerful figures.
Well, the top 10 spots on Forbes' list includes 5 men and 5 women. Beyonce captured the top ranking, bumping off entertainment mogul Oprah Winfrey from first place last year to 4th. Now, the Forbes credited the 32-year-old singer's rise to her massive concert tour and string of chart hits, which ranked an estimated $115 million over the past 12 months, pushing her ahead of her husband Jay-Z, who ranked 6th. Basketball player LeBron James jumped from 16th to 2nd place this year, thanks to endorsement deals worth $72 million. But the most impressive rise on the list was Dr. Dre, who came in at number 3. The 49-year-old co-founder of Beats Entertainment climbed from the 63rd spot by earning $620 million in 2014, thanks to his recent deal with Apple. Charity?
All right, good stuff there. Thank you very much for that, for those stories, and we'll see you back here in just about 2 hours. And now let's get weather updates from our Kim Bo-kyung at the Weather Center. It was a hot day here in Seoul. We got to keep our office and studio very cool, so that's good for us. But I hear it was even hotter down south.
Yeah, that's right. The daytime high in Seoul peaked at 31, while things soared to over 33 degrees in Daegu. And a heat wave warning was issued for parts of Gyeongsang-Pukto province earlier today, but that has now been lifted. At the moment, some inland regions are getting over 10 millimeters per hour of heavy precipitation. And monsoonal fronts are moving up, and they're expected to hit the southern regions tomorrow. We are looking at about 20 to 60 millimeters of precipitation for Jeju, whereas 5 to 40 millimeters are in store for Jeollanam-do and Gyeongsang-Namdo provinces. We're not done with the rain yet, not monsoonal rain, but sporadic showers are expected for Seoul and Gyeonggi-do province, dropping between 5 to 20 millimeters. So it looks like an umbrella is a must for tomorrow. On to Wednesday's ratings. Seoul hits 31, while Gwangju and Busan reach the mid-20s. On to other regions. Daejeon peaks at 28, while Jeju and Dokdo make it to 22 and 25. Over in Brazil, mostly sunny skies are forecast over in São Paulo, so no worries of the weather getting in the way. That does it for now, but I'll be back with more after 10.
Thanks, Bo-kyung. And that wraps up this edition of ARIRANG News. Thanks for watching, and do join us again at 10 p.m. Korea time for Primetime News. See you then.